The UK is not innocent. That has been one of the main cries of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has spread across the country in response to the murder of George Floyd. Britain is not innocent when it comes to police violence, to the disproportionate incarceration of black men, or the economic inequality which cuts across racial lines in our country. And in Bristol this weekend, one aspect of Britain's crimes was thrust into public attention when a statue of a slave trader was felled and thrown into the sea. To discuss the falling of Edward Colston, I'm joined by Bastani and Ash Sarkar. How are you both doing?
Good.
Much better for having watched that video.
It was great. It's the highlight of 2020.
Exactly, I agree. Later in the show, to talk about the political fallout from the weekend's events, we'll be joined by Labour MP Ribeiro, Addy. But first, we're going to talk you through what exactly happened with all the relevant clips. Before we do that, tweet your comments on the hashtag TiskiSour and share the show link on social media. So, on Sunday, at the Bristol Black Lives Matter demonstration, a statue of slave trader Edward Colston was pulled down by protesters. Let's take a look at the dramatic footage. So after being pulled down, the statue was rolled from the city centre to Bristol's harbour. This is what happened next. So this is a slave trader responsible for the trafficking of 84,000 Africans to the Americas to be sold into slavery. 19,000 died on the journey. It's obviously an outrage that this statue was ever allowed to stay in Bristol city centre for so long. But the fact that he was dragged to the harbour and thrown in the sea, like so many of his victims, has a certain poetic justice to it. Ash, what's your take on the scenes we saw in Bristol this weekend?
Pure, unadulterated joy. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. I got a barrage of texts from one of my friends, which was just like, "This is great. He's in the bottom of the river. Stop whining. No one can do anything about it. Done now in the harbour." And I think what I love about it is that we've become so used to politics being this thing which happens through the sort of grinding negotiations in Parliament within institutions which are ultimately frustrating and haven't been able to deliver the kind of social change or justice that people really, really need. And to have a political action just cut through that, and for the statue to be taken down, not because of this long, drawn-out battle with a council or some kind of petition to a higher authority, but because a young and diverse crowd led by Black people said, "We're not going to have this anymore staring at us." The celebration of a man who's responsible for the enslavement of thousands of people, the deaths of at least 19,000 people in the Middle Passage. He's gone. He's in the harbour. And as you said, the symbolism of that happening in the very docks where his slave ships would come in, and the fact he's at the bottom of that water rusting, just love it.
Aaron, your reaction?
Yeah, you've seen sort of various people offer sort of soporific platitudes today, whether it's Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak saying that this isn't how justice is administered. I would disagree. What we saw on Sunday in Bristol is pure, unadulterated justice. It's a justice that can't be performed by bureaucracy and by paper clips and by pens and tick boxes. And by the way, I don't say that in a sort of dismissive way. All of those things are needed for the everyday reproduction of a liberal democratic society. But it was an instantiation, I think, of pure justice. I mean, I sound like Robespierre perhaps, but I can't think of many other ways sort of to put it. And there's a beautiful picture of a young black guy with Black Lives Matter t-shirt, Black Lives Matter face mask, with his knee on the neck of the statue. A young black guy next to him with a t-shirt saying something about Trump. Donald Trump is a waste man. And it's like, if you wanted to, and I don't want to aestheticize it too much because it's a very political action born of a great deal of historic suffering. But if you wanted to almost sort of, compose a sort of historic painting, justice, it would look like this. And I kind of, I mean, look, we'll talk about the sort of political responses to it, but I didn't expect them to be quite so bad. I mean, we are talking about a former slave trader. There we are.
We're going to park Starmer for now, and I suppose the government, because we're going to talk about that in detail when Bell comes on. But first of all, what I want us to do is address, and I imagine debunk, the sort of two main forms of criticism which have been thrown at this action on Sunday. So the first of them is this idea that we shouldn't erase history. So first, this comes in the form of people saying, we can't get rid of statues because that's trying to erase our history. That's trying to pretend our past is something it wasn't. And the other closely related brand is the one that says, oh, people in the past, they all had problematic views and problematic activities and ways of making a living that now we see to be completely unacceptable. So our example of this from today is, surprise, surprise, Julie Hartley-Brewer, talk radio host. So she tweets, breaking news. Can we get this up? Almost every single person from British and world history probably doesn't share your values today and almost certainly did bad things at a time when they weren't necessarily thought to be bad things and which you won't like. Now, yeah, I mean, as plenty of people have said on Twitter, that might be fine for something like flares, but this was slavery. I mean, the 84,000 people he was transporting from Africa to the Americas, I don't think they thought it was fine at the time. Also, I mean, this is just a complete category error in this particular issue, because Winston Churchill, right? He was a colonialist and a racist, but he's also remembered for helping to defeat the Nazis. He's someone with a complicated past. Edward Colston was just a slave trader who gave some money to charity. That's his only legacy. So this idea that we're going to cancel him because he did something, the only thing he's famous for is the slave trade. So the fact that you would celebrate him is nonsense. And of course, we have learned more about Edward Colston from this action, him being thrown into the harbour, than we ever have from that statue standing. I sort of would beg you to find anyone in this country who knew much about, well, a few people in this country would have known something about Edward Colston before this, but the number will have dramatically increased since this action. Ash, you on this, this idea that this is an attempt to erase history.
So I don't know about you, but I was very surprised when I went to Germany and I didn't see a single swastika or Nazi statue when I was wandering around Berlin, because I thought, why would they want to erase their history like that? You might not be familiar. There was this guy, Hitler. He was in charge of Germany. You probably won't have heard of him because you didn't see any statues around. And when you make that comparison, right, which is that Germany obviously did confront its Nazi history, had to undergo a program of denazification. And that didn't lead to a forgetting of the horrors of the Nazi regime, but rather the ability to remember it correctly, because you weren't left with these objects which is integrated into your everyday fabric of reality, which made it seem like all those things were okay. So not only do I, reject the idea that you're erasing history by taking down these statues, I actually propose the idea that by having a confrontation with these statues, by tearing it down, by having this political moment of throwing it into the harbour, that it's a better historical education than leaving it up ever was. Oh.
Aaron, your take? Are you still there?
Yeah, no, I'm here. The whole thing about, historical context, it requires nuance. Of the tens of thousands of people trafficked in the ships, which, were overseen by, was it the Royal African Company? Of the tens of thousands of people trafficked basically from West Africa to Britain's colonies in the West Indies, how many of them do you think were saying, well, look, there's a debate to be had here actually, and there's a bit of nuance, and yes, about 15 to 20% of us are dying on ship, and they're throwing some people overboard, and we've been ripped out of our culture, our society. We're going somewhere we've never been before. We're going to be brutalized. But look, there's two sides to the story here. No. Nobody who was a slave thought there was nuance and context. So this whole thing is ridiculous. The only people that thought what they were doing was okay were the people making money from it who weren't the slaves, and they chose to give a blind eye to evil because they profited from it. So, I mean, it's not like we're talking about, in Africa there was there was also a conversation on the Gold Coast, and many people volunteered to be slaves, and actually it's more complicated. It's just bullshit. It's just so stupid and dumb. Who actually thinks this? Actually, I can tell you, it's people like Julia Hartley-Brewer. Nobody who engages their brain and thinks about this logically for more than 10 seconds buys the line that there's a context-specific, nuanced issue. There have been slave insurrections since forever, since, the Roman age, since, in antiquity. It's talked about very frequently. So it's absolute garbage.
In terms of the question of history, remembering, I thought this was very nice from Bristol Council. I mean, we can talk about why they'd allowed the statue to remain up for so long, but I thought their response to it falling was quite nice. So let's get up this picture. They've collected all the signs that were laid in the city after yesterday's Black Lives Matter protest, and they're going to preserve them on display in the History Museum, which I think is a brilliant response. Let's go to the other form of opposition to this action from Sunday. The idea that the statue should have come down, or it would have been fine if it came down, but only if it had happened via the legal means. And we're going to go to a tweet by Sajid Javid now as the representative of this position. I grew up in Bristol. I detest how Edward Colston profited from the slave trade, but this is not okay. If Bristolians want to remove a monument, it should be done democratically, not by criminal damage. Now, that might seem like a reasonable point. It's definitely more reasonable than the one that Julia Hartley-Brewer came out with. But there is a problem. There has been a long-standing campaign to try and remove this particular statue from the centre of Bristol, and in fact from the names of schools, of concert halls, all sorts of institutions around Bristol are named after this slave trader, and all of them have been blocked. So in fact, not only plans to take this statue down have been blocked, but even completely minor ones to put a plaque on that puts his existence, that statue, in proper context. Even something so minor was blocked by normal democratic channels, or normal, legitimate political channels, as Sajid Javid would call them. I want to get up a passage from the Bristol Post. This was from an article last year explaining the difficulty of getting a statement agreed. This was an idea as the plaque that was going to go under the statue. So can we get this up? So originally, this is about the statement they were planning to put up. Originally, it was a 3-paragraph statement which revealed how Colston played an active role in the enslavement of more than 84,000 Africans, including 12,000 children, and of those, 19,000 died on board his ships. So it goes on. It was controversial, at least for one Tory councillor, Richard Addy, who said that he objected so strongly to the wording that he said he would understand if it was vandalised or stolen. I wonder what he says now. But then Bristol Live revealed last August that there was a significant problem. A Bristol historian, Francis Greenacre, on behalf of the Merchant Venturers, the organisation Colston belonged to, which still holds services and commemorations in his honour today, got involved. A debate ensued, with the wording of the plaque changing gradually, with Mr. Greenacre challenging it, removing things like his position as a Tory MP, changing the word trafficked to transported, and maintaining a lengthy dispute about the numbers and ages of the thousands of children who died on board Colston ships. So there you have it. There was a long, drawn-out campaign. That was, the pinnacle of a 25-year campaign to try and get either this statue removed or put in context. And the people who were part of the same organisation that Colston was part of were not happy unless you had a sort of mealy-mouthed statement underneath there that, tried to put, well, there should be no nuance, but that's what they're trying to do, trying to say, this wasn't as simple as it was. Was it 84,000? Was it 64,000? Like, what the fuck? So this idea that people should have just, why didn't people think to start a petition? Why didn't people think to lobby their council people? They'd been doing that for decades.
So we don't have statues by accident. We don't have monuments by accident. We don't have memorialization by accident. They have to be preserved and they have to be maintained. And so what we have when it comes to the Edward Colston statue is, one, the fact it went up in, 1895. So the statue goes up, well over 60 years after the Slavery Abolition Act passes, which outlawed slavery in the British Empire in 1833. And on the original plaque, it said he was amongst, the wisest men in the city, one of the best and wisest men. So you have this kind of, quite literally, a whitewashing of the role slave money has played in building the city of Bristol and also building this man's reputation and his legacy immediately when the statue goes up. But it's not enough to put a statue up, you have to keep it up. And that's why you need these strange organizations with their kind of pet historians like Francis Greenacre to make the case of why this slaver was a good slaver, or why the slave trading he did wasn't particularly bad. And if you actually looked at the issues, and what it does is that it just creates noise. It just creates a kind of fog around the issue. So you lose sight of the very clear moral point, which is why are we celebrating a slave trader in a diverse city in the 21st century? That's what the whole thing is about. And it's a way of clogging up the political process. Now, this is where I differ from both Sajid Javid, and I'm sure we'll talk about him later, Keir Starmer. I actually think that protest and the action of those protesters, I don't think it was violent. People didn't get hurt. It was a statue. He doesn't have nerve endings. He doesn't have feelings. I think it was a legitimate political action, because the so-called legitimate means by which politics takes place, of petitioning the council, or writing to this person, or writing an article, it had no effect, because those processes have been corrupted and corroded by the lingering poison of slavery.
Yeah, there's always, we've touched upon it. There was also a substantial interest to just to keep it up, and this is something because sometimes democracy isn't adequate in dealing with these things. Wow, that sounds contentious. What do I mean? Well, if you're talking about, let's say you're talking about a city which has a 25% black population. I mean, Bristol doesn't, but let's just say you do, and many of those people are living in a contemporary world which obviously manifestly has racism. Some of them know that their ancestors were trafficked from West Africa to the West Indies and so on and so forth. For them, that's a very painful thing to look at that statue. Now, they're not in the majority, but the question is, what's the basic level of rights and respect and dignity you give to minorities in a society where they are minorities? It's like saying, well, we've only got 15% Jewish people in our society, so it's okay to have this massive statue of an anti-Semite. Nobody would think that's acceptable. It's just strange how that same quite obvious logic isn't extended to Black British people. I mean, it's not strange. We know why. It's because anti-Black racism is the most mundane form of racism around. It's so mundane we don't even think about it. So mundane that white people think it's okay to have a slaver statue, apparently. Even though, as I think just in 10 minutes of conversation, we've illuminated just how stupidly grotesque that is. But yeah. We also have to go beyond the conversation around democracy. If you're talking about somebody who's done this, inflicted such pain on a minority of people, they still are justified in wanting the removal of something. Very important.
It's also, I mean, it's part of sort of liberal political philosophy, the idea that because democracy is majoritarian, you might need checks and balances like civil disobedience, whereby minorities can make their voices heard. We are going to go on to our next section, talk about the political fallout in a moment. First of all, we've got some comments. Anna Legg, $23.99 super chat. Thank you very much. Thank you from Bristol for being the sane voices I need in between arguing with bigots on Facebook. Well, keep up the good work with the arguments, I suppose. Share the show link. We've nearly got 2,500 people watching. Let's try and get that up to 3,000. I love it when we get up to 3,000 in the live shows. Okay, I think we've got Belle Ribeiro Addy here, have we? Can we get Belle in?
Hi.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Happy to be here. Much better.
It is better in the studio, isn't it? But it is more convenient this way. We're going to prompt the conversation, start off the conversation with a clip. This is Priti Patel in Parliament today. She's going heavy on the law and order angle when speaking about the felling of Edward Colston.
I agree with the many peaceful protesters that racism has absolutely no place in our society. Black lives matter, but police brutality in the United States is no excuse for the violence against our brave police officers at home. So to the quiet law-abiding majority who are appalled by this violence and have continued to live their lives within the rules, I hear you. To the police who have been subject to the most dreadful abuse, you have my full backing as you act proportionately, fairly, and courageously to maintain law and order. And to the criminal minority who have subverted this cause with their thuggery, I simply say this: your behaviour is shameful and you will face justice.
So, Belle, I want to ask you about sort of 2 points she made there specifically and sort of take them separately. So the first is she's saying this is all about what happened in the US. Why are British police taking flack at demonstrations for what the American cops did? And the second one is saying that the people doing these things are a criminal minority taking part in thuggery who must face justice. So can I get you on that to sort of give your thoughts on that first idea, which is her question: why are people protesting here because of something that's happened in America?
It's absolutely not just about what's happened in America. We know as much as anything that Black people have died at the hands of the police in this country, and it has happened for years, actually. And not one person has been convicted following this. Not one person has faced any sort of prosecution. And so people protesting out in the UK hasn't just been about that. They were protesting against racism, and they're protesting against state-sanctioned violence in the UK too. So that idea is absolutely ridiculous. And on the issue of thuggery, just the word thuggery, I think to myself, how loaded that is and what you could take it to mean, especially when you're talking about Black people protesting, being thugs. I think it's absolutely disgraceful. We're talking about a slave trader, and the fact that those protesting against racist violence would be seen as the ones that are in the wrong is just completely unfair, especially given the context and especially given what's happened recently.
I think Ash is keen to come in on Priti Patel.
Oh, I've been chomping at the bit to come in on Priti Patel. I've been chomping at the bit because one of the things that was really striking about her performance in Parliament today was that when she was asked whether or not the government really understood the nature of racism in the UK, she snapped back and she said, well, it must be another Home Secretary who was called, Packy as a child, who, faced abuse in the streets, who was advised to change her surname in order to get ahead in their career. And I thought about this very particular way in which the Conservative Party, particularly since the era of David Cameron, but I think really has, kicked up a notch since when Sajid Javid first became Home Secretary, have quite cynically used race and the race of some of the most prominent politicians who are of colour in order to insulate the party from criticism when it comes to the impact that their policies have had on ethnic minorities in this country. And I think it's something which needs to be called out. And obviously not very many people could do it because it's one of those things that people of colour need to say. But you can see it really clearly. Sajid Javid was our first non-white Home Secretary. And why did he come in? It's because Amber Rudd had to fall on her sword after the Windrush crisis. And I remember Sajid Javid's first speech in Parliament when he became Home Secretary. And he spoke very movingly of, his parents and their experience of immigration, and talked about how that would lead to a sense of empathy in his role as Home Secretary. Did we see that empathy? No. Shamima Begum's baby died in horrific conditions. She had her citizens stripped in a way which I think was completely unjust. She should have been brought back here to face trial. And meanwhile, the core elements of the hostile environment policy which led to the Windrush scandal in the first place have been left to continue. And so I think when you see Priti Patel oscillate quite wildly between this quite hardline law and order, bringing down the full force of the police upon people who are exercising their right to civil disobedience, actually, and then flipping it around and saying, how dare you accuse me of not understanding racism because of what it is I have personally experienced. I think that does need to be called out. And the problem is that our anti-racist movement in this country, it's not in the place that it should be. It's having to sort of rev up again after many years of being dormant. It's not got the same kind of institutional left power as the US anti-racist movement has. And so I think we're quite shy when it comes to calling out this stuff because it's come in the guise of liberal identity politics. But I just want to say, I see it. I see the cynical wielding, and not on my watch. Not on my watch.
I want to put that question to you, Belle, actually, about, well, Are you surprised at the size of this movement? So I know that you've been, very active in racial justice struggles from being a student right up to becoming an MP. And whilst, obviously we're all going to agree that Priti Patel is completely wrong, that this is just about something that happened in the US and has nothing to do with Britain. It's kind of the premise of the show. It's still, I wouldn't necessarily have expected this protest to get so big so quickly, prompted by something that happened in the United States. I don't know if you had that same surprise, or if you saw this coming, if this is, what you think was always bound to happen.
I think that people have had enough, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better, and that's why more and more people have come out. I think there's been a great kind of online presence that's really boosted people wanting to get involved and wanting to change things. But not just that, I think it's got a lot to do with what's been happening recently with the coronavirus. I think that's definitely had an impact on how people are feeling. Obviously, I know it's not directly an individual doing something to people from the Black community. When more Black people are dying, and it's clear that more Black people are dying, and they're continuously putting that situation, I think people have grown increasingly frustrated. So perhaps if this wasn't happening at the time it's happening now, it might not have been so big. But I think just generally there is a feeling here and in the US that this keeps happening again and again. More and more Black men die in custody and nothing is done about it. And just the constant frustration of there always being an excuse. There's always an excuse. There's always a reason. There's always an underlying health. With George Floyd, you saw that they attempted to say there was some sort of underlying health condition. That's the reason why he died, not because of the knee in his neck. And if his family didn't go and get their own kind of examination, they wouldn't have been able to mount the challenge that they have now. And that's what we see happening to families in the UK. There are families in the UK that have been fighting for justice for years. When you hear some of their stories and the complete mishandling of those investigations, when you hear stories of young Black people being stopped and searched routinely, or how their lives are ruined when they make a mistake when they're younger and something happens to them. We're looking at the issue of drugs in particular. You see a situation where it actually seemed that in order to be in the Tory party leadership contest, you should have admitted to taking drugs. I think there's only one of them that hadn't, but quite literally they get to take drugs, carry on, be an MP, be a minister, be the prime minister, and a young Black person might get caught with some drugs, and look what happens to them. Even if it's before they're 18, it can end up ruining their entire lives, not because of what they've done, but because of their lack of family connections, and just because they're Black. And you see there's not a lack of talent in our communities, but there's certainly a lack of opportunity, and people are looking at this and they're feeling this injustice, and they're just getting increasingly frustrated. And I think that's why it's come out in the way it has. But I do worry because we've seen protests like this before. Perhaps we haven't seen them as widespread across the country, and perhaps we haven't seen them at such a sustained time. But I worry that it could just all die down very quickly. So I think it's very, very important that people keep up the pressure, that people remember why they were protesting in the first place. They don't get caught up in a hype, because if it's just hype, it's something that dies down. And they realize that, people have made headway. I'm looking at and thinking about all of the people that you wouldn't usually expect to come out and say something positive about race, feeling forced to come and say something positive about race and challenging racism. So it is making a difference. We just need to keep up the pressure.
I want to go to our next clip, which is probably actually going to be more controversial. It's definitely caused a lot of controversy on my timeline today. This is Keir Starmer addressing the felling of Edward Colston this morning, speaking on LBC.
You'll know where we're going, I would imagine. The actions by a small number of people in Bristol who decided to topple and then throw into the harbour a statue. Sarkar.
Yeah, shouldn't have been done in that way. Completely wrong to pull a statue down like that. But stepping back, that statue should have been brought down should have been taken down a long, long time ago. You can't in 21st century Britain have, a slaver on a statue. A statue is there to honour people. And you can't have that in 21st century Britain. That statue should have been brought down properly with consent and put, I would say, in a museum. This was a man who was responsible for 100,000 people being moved from Africa to the Caribbean as slaves, including women and children, who were branded on their chests with the name of the company that he ran. Of the 100,000, 20,000 died en route and they were chucked in the sea. He should not be in a statue in Bristol or anywhere else. He should be in a museum, because we need to understand this. That should have been taken down a long time ago.
So the majority of that clip was Keir Starmer explaining why he thinks that the statue of Edward Colston should have been taken down a long time ago. But it's that first sentence which has caused some controversy, at least on the left. I'll lay my cards out on the table in a moment. First of all, I want to go to you, Belle, for your reaction to that video. Was he right to sort of say it shouldn't have been done in that way? But, you know, the statue should have come down a long time ago?
I mean, definitely. Obviously, we all agree on the fact that the statue should have come down a long time ago. But it not being done in that way, I don't think any of us are in a position at any point in time to say it shouldn't have been done in that way. I think of actually, and because it's in this particular context, how people have jumped on the fact that these individuals have committed some sort of criminal damage or they've done something wrong. And I think about the fact that when people die in police custody, again, there's always some sort of explanation. There's always, oh, actually it's alleged, nothing has actually happened. So it's not alleged that somebody has committed criminal damage. People are insisting that these individuals have committed criminal damage, and I don't think that's necessarily right to say that until any sort of investigation's been put forward. But also, I don't know if it's appropriate for there to be an investigation when we think about the fact that there are people genuinely still fighting for justice for their families and in need of police resources to do that, be it through actually having contact with the police and having died in that way, or people like Belly Majinga or Shukri Abdi, those individuals who need police resources to find justice, and instead we're going to use those to look into what's happened when a slave trader's statue has been put into the harbour. I just don't think that's the best use of resources at all. Not just that, the Bristol police actually probably had the best explanation when you heard what happened, because I saw the statue rolling down and I thought, gosh, aren't there any police there? Is nothing happening? And one of them actually came on TV, explained, look, we understand what the history of this statue is and what a contentious issue it's been for Black people in the city. And because of the type of protest that's happening and because of public safety, we saw it happening, yes, and we thought that the best thing to do was let it happen. So the police thought that the best thing to do was let it happen. And just generally, what happens in history, after a while in history, people don't judge things the same. I think about a group of people at the beginning of the last century who were frequently accused of criminal damage. They were also fighting for civil rights. They were a group of women. They were called the suffragettes. I don't believe anybody would condemn them today. In fact, a couple of years ago, Millicent Fawcett's statue was put in Parliament Square. The same woman that was accused of criminal damage in her civil rights struggle for women's rights. And a few statues down from her is Nelson Mandela, another individual who this government called a terrorist. So I just think to myself, we need to think about things in the current context and just be a bit more mindful of what we say about individuals when they commit, when they do certain things, and just the fact that it was a statue of a slave trader. It wasn't an individual. It wasn't an individual that has been killed. It wasn't a man. It was a hunk of metal which symbolized racism and shouldn't have been there in the first place. And the fact that it's at the bottom of the harbour now is something that people may disagree with. But if there is any attempt to use public money, especially after years of austerity, to try and fish that thing out of the harbour at an expense to something else, there are going to be a lot of questions to answer.
I mean, I agree with all of that on a personal level. I'll go to Aaron in one moment. I mean, my thought on this was that, yes, I I celebrate what they've done. I think they were absolutely right to do it. But I also think that as the leader of the Labour Party, you want to be careful what battles you choose. And I feel the Tories don't want to have a conversation about racism and slavery. We saw that today when their spokesperson was unwilling to sort of say whether or not Boris Johnson thinks statues of slave traders could come down. They're desperate to have a conversation about law and order, about whether or not the law should be enforced and people should follow laws. And I think if Keir Starmer had sort of come out and said, oh yeah, no, it is fine in some exceptional circumstances to break the law, then we would have had a week-long debate about that. And I've heard people say, well, he could have just not condemned it, or he could have just sort of sat on the fence. When you're sitting next to Nick Ferrari, he actually doesn't normally let you sit on the fence. So he would have been pushed on that question, and then we would have had a headline about whether or not it's fine to break the law instead of a headline about racism and slavery. Maybe I'll put that straight back to you, Belle, before going to Aaron.
Yeah. But I mean, the main point is whether or not they have actually broken the law. And I think perhaps it was difficult because of the fact that the media and the government have portrayed it in the fact that they have broken the law. They've come outright and said these people have done something and they've committed criminal damage. But the point I'm trying to make is it's not even necessarily about whether it's right or wrong. It's the fact that when Black people die, we need to look into the situation. When the statue of a slaver is thrown into the harbour, we can instantly label people as criminals. And that's not necessarily what we do in this country. It's innocent until proven guilty. But why, when it comes to Black people, it's one way. When it comes to a hunk of racist metal, it's another way.
What they did was probably criminal damage. I wish I had been with them. I wish I had done, if I had done that, the people involved in taking down that statue will never be involved in a more righteous, morally just action for the rest of their lives. But it was probably against the law. But guess what? So was Rosa Parks. What she did was against the law. Having an interracial, marriage in the United States, in many states before the mid-1960s, they were called miscegenation laws. That was against the law. Often things can be against the law. It doesn't mean it's about right or wrong. So in a way, what we need to say to people, what we need to communicate is there is a bit, and this is true, there is a big enough movement here that if that happens to you, there'll be support. If there are legal costs, they would be backed. And I think BLM now, it's had such goodwill from BLM UK. It's raised a lot of money. It's had so much goodwill. If there are people who are arrested and charged, they will get the appropriate legal backing. It's criminal damage ultimately. What the suffragettes did was criminal damage. I think it's justified. So then you need a conversation around justification. Now, if they were charged with something like violent disorder, that would be a political charge, because clearly it's not violent disorder. It was just a piece of inanimate metal which was taken down and put in a river. Nobody felt endangered. Nobody felt their personal safety was compromised, that they might be subject to violence. So it all kind of depends. If this was being subject to political, if this was a sort of political fight picked by the government, picked by the Crown Prosecution Service, they would be charged with violent disorder. Then it becomes a very political, contentious debate. If it's just criminal damage, that'd be fascinating. If they were found guilty of criminal damage and then they were being sentenced by a judge, I'd be intrigued to know what the judge would do. If it was just some old fuddy-duddy, Oxbridge-educated, 70-year-old white judge sentencing some young Black people to a really harsh sentence for criminal damage for taking down the statue of a racist, well, that would tell us a lot about the limits of our criminal justice system in this country.
I mean, it's also, I think you should encourage leniency, right? I mean, there's a difference between saying it wasn't against the law and just saying, well, it looked like criminal damage, didn't it? But I think the judge should take into account the fact that they were doing this for, a pretty good reason, and hopefully they get off with a suspended sentence or something.
No, I'm just to touch on what you're saying. If you, in all cases, if something happens to an individual and they die, it's not necessarily murder. And that sounds like a terrible thing to say, but some people may have done things in self-defense. So it's not as clear cut as they've definitely done this. And some people have been having a discussion about that as well, and just thinking to themselves how interesting it would actually be to go to court. Not that I want it to get there, but yeah, it would certainly set a very interesting precedent. And I'd hope that if it did, people would be very, very clear and clear about the fact that whereas something may have happened and it might not have been what is within the current law at the moment, that doesn't necessarily mean at the end of it that anybody should face any prosecution.
Right, I'm going to go to the YouGov poll and then get Ash's thoughts. So YouGov did a poll, Britain's on the removal of the Edward Colston statue. Can we get this up? So the percent of people who approve of the statue being removed and the way in which it was done, 13% of people agree with that. Approve of the statue being removed, but not in the way in which it was done, 40% of people agree with that. Disapprove of the statue being removed, 33% of people agreed with that, and don't know, 14%. So, I mean, what I was saying on Twitter today was that I'm 100% in that 13%, but I completely understand why Keir Starmer wouldn't pick that particular battle. Ash, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I just sort of liked Bell's line that it might not be criminal damage. I kind of like the idea of like Edward Colston tripped and fell and he rolled into the harbour. We all saw it. But on this matter of the polling, and I think this kind of speaks to the situation that Keir Starmer was in, because I understood the point that you were trying to make, Michael, but for me, I want a Labour leader who wants to change people's minds about certain things. And I want a Labour leader who is able to articulate a position of solidarity with racially oppressed communities. And I don't feel that Keir Starmer has done that so far in a way which feels powerful, authentic, or real, or likely to, I think, be a strong enough bulwark against this kind of rising tide of, nationalism and racism that we're seeing in this country. And so when it comes to that 13% approves of the circumstances in which the statue was taken down, 40% doesn't think it should be up, but doesn't approve in the way in which it happened, we get to the really sticky point about how we in this country think of our own history when we get the opportunity to learn about it, which is often at a point which is far too late. We go, oh yeah, that's quite bad. But because it's too late, we don't actually get the chance to do the thing that we could have done before, which is demonstrate that our legal system is capable of delivering justice, or demonstrate the fact that we have an education system which is able to, rather than trying to whitewash colonial history or minimize colonial history, is actually going to deliver that kind of confrontation with history that you see in other countries, in particular Germany. We have a sort of condemning of the means by which people express themselves when all other avenues have been closed off to them. And so that's the place that Keir Starmer finds himself in, which is, does he go along with this quite, pacified political population, or does he try and change it? Does he try and shape the common sense in some way? And I think what was demonstrated in that Nick Ferrari interview today, and this is also why I called Keir Starmer a neek, is that he backed off from that. Now, it might be a pick your battles thing, and I do understand that you cannot hold Keir Starmer to the same political standards as you would, an editor on Novara, for instance. Two very different kinds of political jobs. But I wish there had been some acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the anger that led to that act. And there was none. There was only, wish we'd taken it down sooner. Well, you didn't. And now Edward Colston's in the harbour. Sorry about it.
I think that's good. I mean, David Lammy gave a intervention on GM, what's it called? Good Morning Britain, which sort of basically took the same line as Keir Starmer, but emphasising what you just said there. I think that's a very good point. Aaron wants to come in.
Yeah, I thought it's possible. I agree actually with your point, Michael. The essential point is I don't think Keir Starmer should be apologising for potential criminal damage charges. I don't think the Labour leader should be doing that. It's for the social movements to do that. Now, two caveats to that. Firstly, he could have said everything he said and then finished it with basically what Layla Moran did by saying, but look, isn't it outrageous in the 21st century, we have citizens who feel they have to resort to this. Within 6 months of becoming Prime Minister, I would do X, Y, Z. We would review X, Y, Z in regards to expediting the process whereby democratic process for removing something as objectionable as a statue of a slave trader can happen. Clearly here, the normal bureaucratic process was inadequate. We have to ask why. He could have done that. So he could have done the critique. He didn't have to go all in. And he could have said, you know what? I'm doing something nobody else in the political sort of establishment's doing here. I'm offering a long-term solution. And he didn't. And it was just purely an instinctive, I don't want to get my hands caught here, in the mangle by Nick Ferrari and LBC. It was a purely defensive posture. That's concerning. And, look, he's only been leader for a few months. But I do think, that would have been the best way to go. And then finally, people will say, well, he can win a general election. Corbyn can't. Possibly. Maybe that's the bet. That's why he said what he said. But at the same time, we need to understand that, well, okay, I think without any shadow of a doubt, a Labour leader being as overtly supportive of immigrant rights, LGBT issues, BAME communities as Jeremy Corbyn has moved the dial in this country's political conversation significantly. Now, the question is, if Keir Starmer doesn't win in 2024, to what extent will he have moved the dial himself? Judging from this, not very fast. There's a trade-off going on here. You don't do that so you can have a prime minister who can win a general election. But if he can't win, well, then it's been a complete and utter disaster.
Belle, we're going to talk about horses and traffic lights in a moment, which I think we're not going to subject you to. But first of all, I want to come back with, obviously, you're a Labour MP. You sit in Parliament, remotely or otherwise, at the moment. Where do you see your role in this, and what do you think happens now? What happens next? Well, what do you see as the next stages in this particular struggle?
Well, I think we've definitely got a fight on our hands in terms of making sure that this issue isn't just brushed under the carpet, and all of the outrage from the public isn't just brushed under the carpet. We've got an immigration bill coming up, and the thing is, you hear all of these platitudes from people on the Tory side. You hear those who are ethnic minorities tell us that they shouldn't be taking lectures. They won't be taking lectures from us, and despite that, they are about to cement the hostile environment, not just for Black people now, but actually for people coming from EU countries. We can see that what's going to happen with that soon. So I think for us in Parliament, even with our very with the Tories' massive majority, it's just looking for weaknesses, looking for where we can make the largest impact, and where we can bring some of them along with us. I think part of the reason why we've been forced back to Parliament in this way is because the Tories are worried about little rebellions here and there, and we need to be exposing them as much as we possibly can. But what people are looking for, and what those who are protesting against racism are looking for, they're looking for that leadership from us. And I think definitely in this particular occasion, in a way that perhaps maybe they haven't before, a lot of the Black MPs are stepping up. They're stepping up. They're making their voices heard. And I think on this issue, definitely on our side of the house, we can be united.
Great. That's very hopeful intervention. Belle, thank you so much for your time this evening. We'll definitely get you back on soon. Always an absolute pleasure to have you on Tisky Sour.
Bye.
Brilliant, MP. We're going to go to a couple of your comments. So Ingram Snake, a fiver, freeing slaves was also against the law and considered property theft. Yep, very true. Lottie Helu says, with a fiver, replace monuments of slave traders with memorials for the victims of the slave trade. Definitely. Difficult to argue with that. And Luke Barrett tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour, should the plinth be left empty as a reminder, or should someone like Dr. Paul Stevenson, who led the 1963 Bristol bus boycott, be put up instead? Should the statue remain rusting in the bottom of Bristol Harbour, or should it be taken to a museum as an artifact? We'll go quick fire. Ash, you go with what should happen to the plinth, and Aaron, whether it should come out from the sea.
What should happen to the plinth? I would actually like to see submissions and proposals from Black artists from Bristol and the West Country. I don't want to say like, oh, who should we memorialize next? I think that actually the placards which were surrounding it in concentric circles was beautiful. And if it was possible, I would say just keep that. That's how you crystallize the moment. And that's what I would like to see. But if that wasn't possible, I would like to see something maybe a bit more creative than a statue. Like, I know we don't talk about art very much on this show because you two are Philistines. But, I think that we could have actually some really exciting contemporary Black British art rather than just thinking within the box of replace one statue with another statue. As for what to do with Edward Colston, I want him left there. Leave him there and have a plaque to mark the spot. Maybe it would be dangerous because I don't know, like boats have got to go over it or something. I don't really know about water depth and stuff. I'm not a seaman, but I would like to see it left there. Let him rust.
Aaron, should Colston be left in the sea? Or put it, I mean, I think actually both Martin Rees and Keir Starmer have now. So Martin Rees is the mayor of Bristol, who gave, I mean, his response was much better received on the left than Keir Starmer's, but they both seem to be suggesting it should come out of the river and go into a museum.
Why would you? It's like that thing came down like a baked bean can. Why would it be preserved? Melt it down. I'm being serious. Sell it for. We should Novara Media. We should hire a boat. We should get some scuba divers. Get it. Sell it to the local scrap metal merchant. Give the money to BLM UK. That's what we should do. And then in terms of the actual plinth, I agree with Ash. I thought the signs are gorgeous. You could perhaps preserve it with some sort of transparent thing over the square. I mean, personally, I prefer trees to statues. I don't really like statues. The only statues I like are kind of Italian Renaissance ones of like Neptune or Hercules or Perseus.
You need a bit of naked marble bum. That's what you're looking for.
But other than that, I've never really been moved by a statue. I have to be honest. I mean, that's because the whole genre of the statue is about elevating arseholes. That's the whole point of statues. So I know we're sort of breaking with that recently, but that's historically what it's been. You know, powerful rulers, dictators, etc. So you know, I'm open to this, but I definitely think we should just melt it down. You know, one of the best things people are talking about getting rid of the statue of Oliver Cromwell because of what he did in Ireland. I think it's a very good argument to do that. I do think there's an argument to be said for people who were prime ministers or political leaders. They should be treated a bit differently because they are, like it or not, central in the national story in a way that somebody like Edward Colston isn't. However, I think there's a good argument to get rid of Thomas Cromwell. But one good thing he did
Oliver Cromwell, not Thomas Cromwell. I like Thomas Cromwell.
Edward Colston, Oliver Cromwell. One good thing Oliver Cromwell did was melt the crown jewels. And people don't know this. You know, he melted all the crown jewels. The crown jewels we have today are from Charles II. And so why can't we, in a fit of Republican pique, you know, melt this statue of this appalling man who will be forgotten by history?
Yeah. I mean, my main thought was a bit practical enough. I think it probably doesn't deserve to go in a museum, but it's also quite big. I mean, I don't know how, you know, it seems like a waste of space.
It's also kind of a shit statue. It's not the most exciting statue.
Piece of crappy tin.
And that's why I kind of felt, I think it's bronze, so it would be worth a lot if you melt it down. And I'm not sure if bronze actually rusts, but I was talking about metaphorical rust, really. But that's the thing about like this insistence of we have to remember these people in a certain way, so put it all in a museum, is that lots of these statues are just really shit. They're just there's nothing to them. And Aaron's right, it was just like about, you know, literally and metaphorically elevating an arsehole above the rest of us. So I don't necessarily think we have to keep these statues alive to keep the study of the history alive. I think it is actually something that obscures our view. And I know I sort of just banged on about it, but we do have a really amazing canon of Black British art, which we don't look at, we don't talk about, we don't consider with the same, you know, care that we do Black American art. And so when I think about just incredible painters like, you know, Sonia Boyce, or even the materials which are generated by Eric and Jessica Huntley at the Walter Rodney Bookshop, and the support that they gave to, you know, Black publishers, Black authors, and the kind of Black art scene which coalesced around it, I would like to see that memorialized rather than just sort of left to the whim of who cares to remember it.
Oh, actually, before we go on to the bit about the horses, we're going to go to the clip of the Bristol police, which was quite interesting. It was them explaining why they didn't intervene. And actually, it's probably a good thing to show because there's a huge contrast with how the Bristol police behaved over the weekend and how the Metropolitan Police did. So let me just scroll down so I know this guy's name. It is the Chief Constable of Avon and Somerset Police, Andy Marsh, talking about the Bristol Police's decision not to intervene in the felling of Edward Colston.
Midway through the protest, we saw CCTV images in our control room of people, protesters, on top of the Colston statue. Within 2 minutes, that statue had been pulled down. We had deployed officers to respond, to take appropriate action, but the commanders on the ground made the decision that to intervene, to arrest suspects, would likely to lead to injuries to suspects, injuries to officers, people who were not involved in damaging property being drawn into a very violent confrontation with the police that could have had serious ramifications for the city of Bristol and beyond. Can you imagine scenes of police in Bristol fighting with protesters who were damaging the image, the statue of a man who is reputed to have gathered much of his fortune through the slave trade. I think there would have been very serious implications. And whilst I certainly do not condone crime or damage of any sort, I fully support the actions of my officers. They responded with common sense, sound judgment, and in the best interest of public safety.
All right, we can keep that in mind when we talk about the Metropolitan Police in one moment, see how it compares. We're going to talk now about the Black Lives Matter protests across the country. I think we've got some footage because they were huge everywhere, really impressive sized protests across the country, especially in the middle of lockdown. So people obviously, it's a difficult decision whether or not to attend. I think we can get up some footage of Manchester. So you sort of had thousands gathering in Manchester. We might be able to get this up. That's not that. That was in London. Don't worry if we can't. You can look them up. Also great images. Lots of people in Glasgow. I mean, you can look it up on Twitter. There's people all across the country. But we are going to focus on what happened in London on the weekend. And we're going to do it via a Darren Grimes tweet. I apologize in advance. So Darren Grimes is a right-wing talking head. You'll often see him on Sky or the BBC. I think he came to fame because he worked for one of the Vote Leave organizations. Can we get up his tweet of the protest? So we've got, listen to them celebrate as they knock an officer from his horse. The radical left, by making false comparisons between the US and the UK, has unleashed hell upon innocent British officers. Our officers get up each morning to keep us all safe. Priti Patel, this cannot go on here. Obviously, lots of hyperbole there. But the big claim there is that protesters have knocked officers from their horse. Let's take a look at the video he was sharing. Now, if you've got a keen eye, you'll notice the problem with what Darren Grimes tweeted there. The horse wasn't knocked off by a protester, but rather a set of traffic lights. Let's take another look. Now, of course, I mean, that looks really painful. I'm sure that was traumatic for the officer involved. I wish her a speedy recovery. But I don't see how racial justice protesters can be expected to take responsibility for a police horse riding into a traffic light. Also important to note that it wasn't just the officer hurt in this situation. So let's take a look at what the horse does next. Oh. Now that looks really painful, right? So what you see there is a protester getting trampled by the horse, which is sort of run off on its own. And we now actually know who that person was. So who that person who was trampled was. She did a tweet thread today about what sounds like an awful experience, and a terrible response actually from the Metropolitan Police. Can we get up this tweet thread? We're not going to show you the whole thing because it's quite long, but just the key part. So my name is Jesse Tieti Mawutu. As you may have seen, there has been a video circulating around of a woman getting trampled on yesterday at a peaceful Black Lives Matter protest, and that individual was myself. I was walking away from the crowd with my younger sister and cousin, rooting to go home. Next thing you know, I was hit and trotted on by the horse. I was unconscious for a few seconds. I now have bruises and swollen limbs. My phone is inaccessible. My coat is torn beyond repair. I'm still so traumatized about the event that occurred. And I mean, from watching that video, none of that's a surprise. It looks like an absolutely horrible situation. She, understandably, quite rightly, goes to make a complaint to the police. And this is the response she gets. So, and this, can we get this up, this tweet? So, and this officer said that it was the protesters' fault that you got trampled on. If this protest remained peaceful, then the police would have never taken action. If you were concerned about the repairs of your phone, then you get your people to make donations. So the police officer saying to them, or saying to this woman, that it's not the police's problem if a horse has literally trampled on her in the street. Incredibly dangerous. It sounds like it was awful, but it could have been worse, Thank God she's not in ICU at the moment. I mean, getting trampled on by a horse, that's a really, really seriously dangerous thing to happen. And they're saying, well, it's not our problem because the horse, the woman fell off the horse, the police officer fell off the horse because of the protesters, and then the horse was not our responsibility. It wasn't even a police horse at that time. It was just a horse running down the road. Let's take a look at why the horses were there. So this is what the horses were doing when the police officers hadn't lost control. This is what they were. This was their intended purpose, as it were. Can we take a look? And this is B-roll as well. Right. So, I mean, this is the idea that you should have police horses doing a charge down Whitehall. I mean, if you saw images of these protests, the protesters look really young. Lots of them looked in their teens, some in their early 20s, but lots of really young people who are out to protest for something they care about. When this happened in Bristol, as you saw from that image, the Bristol police were saying, well, look, we thought if we intervened, more people might get hurt. And also it would look a bit odd if we had the police, you know, defending this slave statue. In London, you have a group of peaceful protesters. And what do the Metropolitan Police do? They come with a huge line of horses and run into them. Like, that's an incredibly dangerous, provocative thing to do. Ash and Aaron, I know you've both been on demonstrations with police horses. They are not particularly nice to be around. What did you make of the scenes that we saw this weekend? I'll go to Ash first.
Well, being charged at by horses when you're in a peaceful protest is a really powerful politicizing moment. And I know that because it was for me and it was for many of my friends during the student movement in 2010. And I heard from a friend of mine, who's still a really close friend of mine, who said that for her, that was a turning point because she remembered being in Parliament Square. It was cold, it was raining, there was a horse charge, and she was terrified. But she expected that to be covered fairly in the media. And then when she looked at the news, it was all about, you know, students erupt into riot, and for her, that was just a huge moment of broken trust between her and the establishment media and the political establishment as well. And it wasn't until Jeremy Corbyn comes along 5 years later that she feels there's any home for her in politics. It was a really, really powerful moment. And from what I've seen of being on these Black Lives Matter protests to cover them is that there's a real change in police strategy. So at the beginning, it's very, very hands off. You have uniformed officers, but you don't have vans of riot cops. They do that thing where, you know, because they've got to look busy, so they kind of harumph off in one direction and then they come slouching back. But there isn't very much confrontation. And then from what I can see, and this was a sort of common thread between what happened on the Wednesday and also on the Saturday, is that when it gets down Whitehall, you know, past that bit, you know, near Downing Street, going towards Parliament Square, it's also, that's a very weird space to be in, just how it's laid out. It's very easy for there to be sort of, you know, the crowd to get split up and then smaller pockets to get crushed up against one bit of wall or another. So for that to be the point at which you lead a horse charge, it's dangerous anywhere you go, but it's particularly dangerous. And it's because of the layout, it's really easy for the crowd that was once peaceful to be put into the state of real tension and anxiety through the presence of, you know, vans and vans of riot cops who are dressed differently from the uniformed officers earlier on the march, who are behaving differently from the uniformed officers on the march, and are being backed up by mounted officers as well. So for me, it's about the fact that this is such heavy-handed and inappropriate policing. And because it's been such a common thread on these Black Lives Matter protests, and it seems to be a common thread when it comes to public order policing around Whitehall, I think that there's a real problem here.
Aaron, what's your take on the Metropolitan Police's behaviour and attitude to peaceful protests in London?
Well, I mean, the stupidest thing I saw, which really aggravated me, was people saying, well, of course the horse bolted, people were throwing things and they were angry and they were upset and there was loads of noise. Well, yeah, it's a protest and people were being confronted with a horse charge. You know, it's not like people see a bunch of horses at a political demonstration. They go, be quiet, there's the horses. Because we have to stop the protest now, guys, because there's horses. Are you fucking, how stupid are you? I saw some of these sort of animal rights people saying, well, of course the horse bolted. Yeah, the horse bolted because it's being abused by the police to be put in that situation. The idea that you'd use like a dozen plus horses to run on wet tarmac in quite a narrow street, you know, Whitehall's it's not huge. I mean, that's so stupid. And ultimately, I mean, imagine if somebody got seriously hurt or died, you know, the Met would be negligent, liable rather. and they would have to pay a bunch of comp, which, by the way, they're probably going to have to do to this young lady. There was an Angolan flag in her bio. I don't know if she's Angolan or whatever. If she plays her cards right, gets a good lawyer, she'll get what she deserves, which is quite a lot of cash. You know, and you compare that to the approach in Bristol, and I understand why the police are so sort of laissez-faire in Bristol, because let's be real, Bristol's not like the rest of England. It's fucking, there's like, you know, there's like fires on the streets and stuff, and people like stoned and, you know, making moonshine. It's kind of almost like, it's kind of like totally different to the rest of
moonshine.
It's true. No, I've had moonshine. I've had moonshine in Bristol. I've literally never had this anywhere else in England. It's totally unique. And so, like, the cops are like, well, look, like, if we behave like the Met, this place would look like, you know, it would look like the 2011 riots every day of the week. When we can't do that. There has to be an element of in Bristol. There has to be a bit of elasticity, a bit more policing by consent than they do in London. In London, it's pure violence. It's horrific. You know, I said this to I know people. I've raised this with people, and they think I'm letting them. You know, I'm an apologist to the police. I lived in Bournemouth for the first 18 years of my life, and they do bad things. There's still systemic racism in a bunch of police forces. But it was so obvious to me straight away how different the Met were. I was like, wow, this feels like an occupying army. This is like, especially at protests, it's like, this is completely different. Their social function is completely different. And that also sort of, that maps onto racialized policing. It maps onto political policing, and it maps onto, you know, ultimately London is the heart of political and economic power in our country. So it's policed in a very, very different way. The surplus population is politicized there in a very different way.
But not just at protests. For me, the most appalling policing I've ever seen has been at Notting Hill Carnival. So especially when you make that approach from, you know, the Kensal Rise end, I saw this one group of young black lads, and they were maybe 15, 16, you know, 17 tops, and they were stopped and searched literally, you know, 4, maybe 5 times, because we were behind them, and each time we were like, these guys have done nothing. We've just seen them stopped and searched. And the next time there'd be an officer, you know, stopping and searching these lads, we've literally seen them be searched by your colleagues like a minute and a half up the road. They're like, yeah, but they could have picked something up on the way. It's like what? And then when you get to the end of the night at Notting Hill Carnival, a friend of mine, me and a friend intervened because we saw a kid, you know, was clearly in his teens, being stopped and searched in handcuffs first. And so if that's how you're being treated by the police, that was supposed to be a street party, right? Notting Hill Carnival was Europe's biggest street party. It's also, you know, its origins were, you know, coming from the racial injustice that was experienced by the Caribbean community and needing, you know, a space to celebrate their culture. And for it to be policed in that way, I think is completely outrageous. And it gives you a little glimmer that when you're on the left and you're not black, the way in which you interact with the police in a way which is antagonistic and hostile and awful is in either some kind of extraordinary situation or on a protest. Whereas if you're a young black male, not even a young black male, if you're just a black male, how you can expect it to be treated by police at Notting Hill Carnival, or maybe on your way home from school and you're stopped and searched, is completely dehumanizing. It's utterly dehumanizing. And so we talk a lot about, you know, oh, we congratulate ourselves in Britain because we think, you know, we're not as, you know, baton happy as the feds in Europe, and we're certainly not as trigger happy as those in America. But our image of what policing by consent means, it really starts to disintegrate when you examine it with any sort of care. And something which I heard from Adam Elliott Cooper, who's obviously a good friend of the show, is that since lockdown has been brought in, you've seen stop and searches of, you know, young black men go up. And so this is a really humiliating form of policing. It happens in public during a lockdown where we should all be really worried about passing on coronavirus, and for what? For small quantities of cannabis. So yeah, drug searches for young black men have gone up.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Of course.
I remember once when I was about 23, 24, no, maybe a bit older, 25, cycling through central London, and I had my hands off my bike, just like you do at like midnight, and the cops pulled me over, and they're like, "Why are you doing that?" And I was like, "It's not illegal. It's not a traffic offence. Like, what are you talking about?" And they were just being really, really aggy. And I don't know what he thought. I don't know. He thought I was. He goes, "What do you do?" I'm a student. Okay, well, I'm doing a master's. He didn't believe me. That's producer ID. And I was like, and it just that one interaction completely like I was like, why was he so needlessly aggressive? There was no criminal offence happening there, and it's like people have to understand. Again, you've got the Greater Manchester Police. You've got South Yorkshire were appalling during the miners' strike and so on. But a lot of these sort of more metropolitan police forces, if you live in like Devon, in like a town or a village of like 10,000 people, yeah, of course you're going to think the police are great or relatively inoffensive. But how they police populations in bigger cities, particularly, populations of colour, working class populations as well, it's very, very different. And that's one of the big challenges for the Black Lives Matter movement, because, ultimately a white person outside the metropolis is going to have a fundamentally different material relationship to the police of a young person of colour in a major city. That's just a fact. So go on, Ash.
Very, very briefly come in. Well, the news broke literally just a short while ago before we went live that a black man has died in police custody in Devon. And so I wonder if, obviously there are more people of colour in metropolitan areas, right? That's where you tend to find communities of colour. But I also wonder if the way we're talking is a reflection of the fact that when you go to more rural areas, less urban areas, is that there's still a lot of, racist policing, but in general...
I said a white person. I'm saying a white person in Devon. I'm not saying a black person in Devon.
Oh, no.
Yeah, just to clarify.
I'm saying that, because there's a smaller community of color, the racist trigger is less frequent, and the nature of there being a lack of a really big community of color also means that those instances of violence are more, they're invisibilized.
For sure.
This is just me speculating.
No, I agree. No, just to clarify, a sort of more rural police force and how it's engaged with by a white person. In a way, it almost, I think it does to an extent supersede even class status. The town country thing and the colour thing is a huge one. Of course, black people and brown people are subject to racist policing across the country. I'm not saying any forces is, although I have to say, Dorset, the police and crime commissioner in Dorset is pro decriminalisation of marijuana, which is great. I think he's the only one in the country. Yeah,
decriminalise everything.
I think we're going to wrap up. First of all, let's go to a tweet on the hashtag #TiskiSour from Ella McLeod. I remember being at open casting call for an Idris Elba movie. Majority black people queuing on the street. Obviously, some neighbor called the cops and legit riot police turned up. Outrageous. If you want to read about a police force which has been or which is about to be disbanded, there is a brilliant article which was published by Novara Media today by Alex Vitali, who was on Aaron's show last week, explaining what it means that the Minneapolis Council have committed to disbanding their police force. I recommend you go read it. For now, thank you everyone for your super chats tonight. If you want to support us directly, then do go to novaramedia.com/support. We'll be back on Wednesday, but tomorrow night, make sure you tune in at 8 p.m. to the Bastani Factor. You've been watching TiskiSour on Novara Media. Good night.